So today we're talking about a topic that I'm extremely passionate about, and I hope you are too. And it's a topic that I think is familiar to all of us. It is implicit in being a human being, but I hope today we can go just a couple layers deeper on it. And if so, I've done my job. The topic is going to be, among other things, how we connect to land and also our ethical viewpoints about land and about animals and things of this nature. So it's kind of continuing the theme we've been working on this whole time. So let's start first by talking about landscapes and placemaking. Um, so I have a love for the book Dune by Frank Herbert. I've never seen the movie, which makes me sad. I need to see it at some point. Is it any good? I don't know. It probably is. Who knows? Anyways, in the book itself, though, multiple times the planet is described that the family moves to, the Atreides family, the royal family, and they, Duke Leto and his family, including his son Paul and the Lady Jessica, they go from this very watery planet and then get displaced to this very, very dry planet. And there are many statements people make about the planet along the way. And indeed, the planet figures prominently in the story, right? The whole kind of story is about control of this planet that on the one hand is so desolate and so dry that people reclaim water from dead people, even to maintain the water supply, and yet at the same time a place that is incredibly economically valuable. There's quotes like, polish comes from the city, wisdom comes from the desert, referring to the free men who in many, many ways define themselves by the desert. You never talk of likelihoods on Arrakis, you speak only of possibilities. On Arrakis, water was money. Arrakis teaches the attitude of the knife, chopping off what's incomplete and saying, now it's complete because it's ended here. So it's clear in this movie, in this book, many, many times that there's both the materiality, the physicality of the planet as this deserty planet with some particular attributes to it. But then there's also sort of all these, as a result of that physicality, there's all these sorts of emotions people bring to the table when thinking of the planet, both positive and negative. And it is that way with all of us, right? So we're talking today about placemaking and about symbolic landscapes. And I want you to think, what places are meaningful to you? How did they become so? And what would it mean for those places to change? In my own life, I have many places that are very, very meaningful to me. One of which is Portland, Oregon, or rather the suburbs of Portland, Oregon, where I grew up. And I can still, when there's certain kinds of rain here in Alaska, and when there is certain kinds of clouds, it brings me back in an instant to my home and to the forest that I used to run around making forts in, and to running and feeling the mud kick up on you when you're running and smelling the air full of that foggy, misty air. It takes me back. I suspect you have places like this as well. Many other places since then that are very meaningful to me. Phoenix, Arizona, very meaningful because it's where I first dated and fell in love with my wife. That's another kind of landscape that I kind of have forever imprinted on my brain, even though I don't visit too often anymore because we live so far, and many others as well. Again, I suspect you have places like that also. We make meanings of places, we construct meanings of them that are much deeper than just, or more than just the materiality of it. If land was just the affordances of the space itself, we might not put nearly as much emotional valence to it, right? Moving might not be quite so big of a deal, particularly if you don't live by family to begin with, or if you don't, work the land. But for many of us, our lands are about a lot more than purely just literally, a half acre, quarter acre, whatever it is, a three bedroom apartment to live in, right? It's a lot more than just the geometric space itself. There's more to the land than that. So how is it that that happens? So today I want to talk about this concept. Again, I think it's implicit to being a human being. And I think the better we can understand placemaking, the better we can understand human beings, the better we can understand ourselves, the better we can understand what it means for a land to be meaningful to us. That helps us understand so many things about this world. It helps us understand sometimes some of the profound effects of environmental changes. You may have experienced before, as I have with Portland, Oregon, what it's like to go back to your home and find yourself, as Edward Casey has said, quote, disoriented, right? Literally have your orientation of a space messed up because your home doesn't look like home anymore. In my case, because of population growth. There's a lot more severe examples of this, right? Indigenous people being entirely displaced from their homes, or in like the palm oil reading by Sophie Chow that you did earlier in this semester. Finding your home pretty quickly gobbled up by all sorts of commercial palm plantations. People's sense of place, as we sometimes say, sense of place, can be severely affected and make them vulnerable to changes in their landscape. At the same time, on the more optimistic side, on the more proactive side, people's attachment to place can also make them highly motivated to put in the time, the effort, the attention, the respect that it takes to heal land, to care for land, to protect land. I have a great colleague, Val Gagnon, works up in Michigan. Great scholar in addition to being a great person. And she talks about lands that are essentially mining waste lands, like where mining waste has gone down a river and then like deposited and essentially made like a sandbar, except for it's like toxic. And then native peoples who have put in a whole lot of hard work to reclaim these lands with traditional plants that had indigenous uses. And it's hard work. Reclamation is hard work. If you've ever been familiar with like reclamation work on old mines or something, it can be really hard, painstaking work, and it's not always straightforward. But people do it, right? Because the lands mean something to them as part of their ancestral territory. And so people's attachment to place can often motivate them to go to incredible leaps and bounds to protect those spaces and to do something with that space. So then understanding it is a huge part of understanding us as human beings, understanding each other, understanding both how we can be vulnerable to environmental change and also how we can be proactive agents in making positive environmental steps and moves and change. It's also an important part of policy and of many of our careers. If you're involved in an NGO working on environmental issues, a nonprofit, you are touching on people's sense of place. And so many of our environmental NGOs have names such as, for example, around here, Cook Inlet river keepers, or Cook Inlet keepers, things like that, right? And you have, you know, Sierra Club, right? Literally the Sierra Mountains, right? Or Friends of the such and such valley and things like that, right? So many environmental nonprofits or NGOs root themselves in a specific place, even if their mission expands over time. And so that'll be an important part of your life if you go that route with your career. It's an important part if you go into policy, right? A huge part of consulting with people, like we talked about last week, is trying to understand what the land means to them on an identity level and what that means to them. So it's useful to have terms and concepts to help us think through that. Again, I think it's something we implicitly understand. We implicitly understand that lands have meaning to people because we all feel it. I'd like to maybe just add a few layers to that. There's a great paper came out in 1994 by Lorraine Grader and Tom Garkovich or I think it's Tom Grader and Lorraine Garkovich. Lorraine, super cool person. Anyways, the paper is Landscapes, the Social Construction of Nature and the Environment. And you've heard me quote it before. They say, every river is more than just one river. Every mountain is more than just one mountain. What they're getting at there is that you have the literal physical space, but then you also have the social constructions, which we, again, back to that theory we talked about a couple weeks ago, the meanings, right? The conversations and the meanings that we then externalize and place onto that space and then internalize as the nature of the land itself. They give several examples. One of the ones I found most compelling, they talk about a Kentucky, like a ranch for horses right outside of, or right in Kentucky. And they talk about the fact that one of the large cities in Kentucky, I'm blanking on which one, there's a couple obviously, but anyways, they talk about a big effort that locals made to buy up a piece of land that was going to become basically like a housing subdevelopment or something like that, because they wanted it to stay in sort of this like ranchy kind of condition. And they point out, you know, even though so many people at this point are no longer directly involved in the horse economy, which was once much more prominent there, it's still a key part of how people see themselves as Kentuckians, right? And so and this specific space had symbolic and historic value in that regard. And we can see that many different places. Here, you know, there's all sorts of memes about Alaskans and how we think about Alaskans, right? And when we talk about Alaska, we're not just literally talking about the subcontinent, although we're also talking about what it means to be Alaskan and how that's connected to the land, much like with that Dune movie, right? About ideas of us as tough, as strong, as independent, things that we oftentimes correlate to the rather extreme weather conditions we go through, among other things, as well as some of the types of isolation we have in some parts of Alaska. So landscapes then, as they suggest, it's a socially constructed view of the land, right? So we're not just meaning landscapes like the way we use it in everyday English. Obviously, we use landscape to mean just like places, the landscape of Texas, or I had somebody come by and do landscaping on my lawn or something. No, what we mean here is a specific concept. Symbolic landscapes is what we sometimes say to further clarify a socially constructed view of the land, which reflects our cultures and reflects very often our sense of identity of who we are. So, the example that I had shared earlier in this unit where I talked about North Texas and specifically Denton, Texas, and that people viewed it as a very unpolluted space, even though it was a quite heavily polluted space from an air pollution perspective, in part because of this strong sense of identity of like, we are a green community, right? And all sorts of interesting things fed into that, from the, color of the local university, green, mean green, to the sort of historic battles to prevent fracking by a large portion of the population. So we tie in our identities to these spaces, and we also tie in our histories, our cultures, our attachments. You can see that a lot with a great kind of, I guess, case study, if we want to call it that, which is Western Apache Nde place making. So Western Apache are a group, of course, that are part of just Apache groups in general. You have Apache groups all throughout Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, historical Apache lands, and at present Apache reservations and areas. Specifically, the Western Apache are one branch of the Apache peoples. And there have been, of course, many notable historic Apache peoples, such as Goyale, Geronimo, one that probably most people is the most familiar, the war leader, as well as others, but also very much, of course, Apache are present day living, vibrant culture. Their former tribal chairman. I don't know if you saw this. This was in the New York Times. Oh, I'm blanking on her name right now. Noreen, but what's her last name? In any case, a well-known activist on a movement that we'll talk about in a minute called Save Oak Flat. But this picture was taken of her at Times Square when there was a big sort of traveling protest, if you want to call it that way, traveling demonstration to stop Oak Flat mining, which is a site that has a lot of significance for Apache people. And the headline for this in the New York Times, I think it was front page, and it was like Katniss Everdeen is real and she's an Apache or something like that. But anyways, place figures really, really prominently for Apache society, including for Western Apache society. And we have a lot of great information about it that I'd like to share with you. But before we do that, I want to just briefly talk about the concept of placemaking. So placemaking and landscape are kind of similar concepts. They're kind of two different ways of talking about a pretty similar idea. Placemaking is the ways in which we make place, which you're like, oh, shocking. Thanks, professor. This is really worth my tuition money. But to put that a little bit differently, there's been starting in the 70s, you had philosophers like Edward Casey and Yi-Fu Tuan, who brought up the idea that we think of space, time and space, as these like primary categories of existence. But as Edward Casey says, we should really think of place as the primary category of existence, because we don't exist in some kind of vacuum of space, of just geometric, like here I am existing in a 5x5 foot container called a room. No, we exist in places, right? We have meaningful attachments to the land and the rooms and the homes around us. So that's what place means, or placemaking. It means to take space and make it into something meaningful, place, in other words, or landscape, if we want to talk about it that way. Although symbolic landscapes more implies that there's like lots of different sites spread across a large area, placemaking can be as small as a single room, right? So, but placemaking, one of the points that Keith Basso brings up in a book that I really like called Wisdom Sits in Places, which is right here, if you can see it, he talks about Wisdom Sits in Places is a great book. Strongly recommend it. One of the best anthropology books I've ever read. In it, Keith Basso talks about Hamlet Castle. And in Hamlet Castle, so he talks about Hamlet Castle. And in regards to Hamlet Castle, one of the things that he says is, he talks about Niels Bohr, the famous physicist who visits Hamlet Castle. And it's just a castle, right? But he talks about how profoundly different it feels because he knows it's the castle attributed to Hamlet. And so the courtyard becomes an entire world. A dark corner reminds us of the darkness of the human soul. We hear Hamlet's to be or not to be, right? When a space, when we know there's history there, it can really transform what that space feels like. So that's an aspect of placemaking, the way in which histories inform our present day emotional, affective, intellectual experiences at a site. So the way in which space becomes place, both through histories and through all sorts of other things as well. And that's something that Keith Basso dwells at on length in his book Wisdom Sits in Places, which I had you read an excerpt from. In the first, and actually in several chapters, he develops this way of talking about Apache place names. So after years of doing ethnography with Apache people and doing a lot of great studies, including one of my favorites, Portraits of the White Man, which talks about white person jokes in traditional Apache society. He'd done a lot of great studies, but then after decades of it and living part-time on the reservation and being pretty well accepted by people, and I think becoming sort of a semi-stable member of the community, he was talking to the chairman and he's like, what should I do next as far as research? And he said, you should really make a map, not a white person map, we have plenty of those, but a Apache map, like a map with our names for our places. And then he finishes with, you should have done this already, which I always thought was such a funny phrase. But in any case, Basso sets out to interview a few different elders who know a lot about Apache place names, and he discovers that there are place names all across the Cibecue Reservation, which is the specific reservation, or the Fort Apache Reservation, including the area of Cibecue, which is where he's at. He finds that there are just dozens and dozens of place names for, not just for the whole territory, but also for very specific, like this specific kind of area that's like a grassy flat, right? But used to have water clearly. And so it's called Water Lies with Mud in an Open Container, which is exactly what it looks like at one point. So he talks about the fact that these place names, they do a lot of things other than just tell you where you are, right? Every society has place names, right? So if I say, go down California Beach Road, okay, California Beach Road, we know what California Beach Road is. Unless you know the particular history, which there's actually really fascinating history there, but unless you know the particular history of the name of that road, it's just like, okay, that's just an identifier of a road. But place names can be more than that. Place names can sometimes be richly descriptive. And so for Apache society, Western Apache society, I should say, Basso found that their place names did many, many different things. There was a very rich history of placemaking. He talks about, for one thing, that it records people's ancient experiences of their people. So for example, he talks about the fact that he talks about Goshklish to Bilsikane, water lies with mud in open containers. And he talks about the fact that as they're talking about that place, and as Basso's struggling badly to pronounce it correctly, they start talking about what it means to say these place names. And he said, it's the speech of the ancestors, is what one of the elders says, Charlie. And he says, they come to this country long ago. Our ancestors did. They hadn't seen it before. They knew nothing about it. Everything was unfamiliar to them. They were very poor. They had few possessions, and surviving was difficult. They were looking for a good place to settle, a safe place without enemies. They were searching. They were traveling all over, stopping here and there, noticing everything, looking at the land. They knew nothing about it, and they didn't know what they would find. None of these places had names then. None of them did. And as the people went about, they thought, how shall we speak about this land? They said, how shall we speak about where we've been and where we want to go? And he says, eventually they come to a place with a bunch of water, noticing this like grassy place with a bunch of water and a bunch of plants, and that there would be good deer and turkey here for hunting. So they named it Gorlish to Bilsikane, water lies with mud in an open container. They made a picture of it with words. Now they could speak about it and remember it clearly as well. Now they had a picture they could carry in their minds. You can see for yourself, it looks like its name. So it's this wetland area, and it truly does look like water lying with mud in an open container. Beautiful thing, right? Making a picture of a place with words. And indeed, for Apache people, the place names are very often very descriptive of the place itself. English place names sometimes are like that, definitely. Towns with names like Hilltop or something like that. You also have a lot of place names like Denton, where I used to live. it doesn't say anything about the place. It's named after this guy, John Denton, minister who had died fighting Comanche and other native people, attacking Comanche and other native people. So a lot of times our city names don't necessarily say anything super specific about the space, but a lot of times Apache place names do say something very specific, and that's true for a lot of indigenous North American groups. There's a great lecture by Alan Boris that you can find on YouTube called Nibena, Nibena, and he talks about being lost and almost freezing to death one time while he was hiking around in the middle of winter. And he didn't know where he was, but he found a lake with a little island in it, a frozen lake with a little island in it, and he realized that it was this place called Nibena, which the name means basically like a lake with an island in it. And then that helped him know, because then he knew that indigenous place name, and then that allowed him to know other close by indigenous place names. And then he got himself oriented and got himself back to his car and successfully didn't freeze to death. Place names can be richly descriptive of the place. That's part of what they can do. They can also record ancient experiences of the people. And when you use the name, you're kind of embodying that to some degree. They call it, in this book, they call it speech of the ancestors, right? They can also sometimes signal environmental change, because when those descriptions are no longer accurate. So for example, in the book, they talk about Snake's Water, this area that in theory had a bunch of water in it, except for now it doesn't. And so they talk about what must have happened, and perhaps people had mistreated. I think there's like a ceremonial breach of how you're supposed to act around snakes. And as a result, things have changed and the water's no longer there. So sometimes place names act as markers of environmental change. And this way they are a very useful and important part of traditional ecological knowledge. But they do more than that. In this study, the Western Apache place names oftentimes were metonymous, by which I mean they were like a mnemonic device. They allowed you to remember a story that was attached to the place. So very often the place wasn't just a place name describing the place, but it had a story attached with it too. So a good example is the place called Shades of Shit. And it's got a story. That's the name of the place. And the reason it's called that is because there's a story about an Apache family that lived there that was not generous. They had relatives that came to them when they were starving, and this family refused to help them out, and indeed shut the doors on them, quite literally, and shut themselves inside. But because they were shut inside their own home, they had nowhere to defecate but inside their own home, and eventually they were like drowning, right, in their own crap. And so it's a powerful story about generosity, a reminder to be generous, and especially generous with friends and love, or family and loved ones, but just in general to be generous, which if you think about it, would have been an absolute necessity historically for Western Apache people in an environment where you're doing hunting and small scale farming in a semi-arid environment where things can go poorly very quickly if the wrong weather conditions don't happen. If you don't happen to find animals that day, you get a flash flood and it messes with your cornfield. So for all these reasons and more, being generous would have been incredibly important, as indeed it is in many small scale societies, and as indeed it is in every society. We just sometimes forget it. So the story names, the place names, oftentimes have a message to them, and people will sometimes tell those stories as a way of helping keep themselves on track. So they talk about speaking with names and shooting with stories, and a way of keeping other people on track. So they talk about like using stories attached to places to critique or reprimand people without even actually directly reprimanding them. They talk about that all over in the book. And they also talk about how it's attached to identity. And so they talk about a piece of land called Juniper Tree Stands Alone that's symbolic of a clan that originates from that area. So that clan is associated with that space. And so place names then for Western Apache people, it's a lot more than just giving us a way to remember that place, although it's certainly that. It's a lot more than just mapping. It's also talking about what the land looks like or what it used to look like. It's also telling stories about what happened here that inform the present. As William Chapman says, the past is at its best when it instructs us right about the present, about what happened here. It gives us a sense of people's different identities and who comes from which places, and it reminds people about how to be properly moral people in that specific society. So for Western Apache people, places were profoundly meaningful, and they helped Basso to think through this bigger issue. And I think it's an important issue of the fact that land is memories, its teachings, its beliefs. It's a lot of things we attach to it. So again, place versus space, making space into meaningful place. And we do that through, as Basil points out, through storytelling, through talking about what happened there and over time expanding on what happened there, right? Remember the Alamo, right? All the stories we have about London, just so many different examples we could talk about, right? Sacred stories about the Ganges. People tell stories, and in those stories, they make a deeper connection to place. But it's also not just stories, it's other things as well. It's identities, it's discourses, all these different ways in which we attach to a space. Landscapes of meaning. And I think that's really useful to think about. And I think it's useful to think about not just for how it helps us better understand each other, although that's the most important reason, but also because it can help us understand contemporary policy and political issues sometimes. So I want to talk now very briefly about a place called Oak Flat, but in doing that, I want to make sure that I'm actually able to do this in a way where you can hear the sound. Share sound. Yes, please. Okay. So Keith Basso's book was all about sort of traditional Western Apache place names. And you might think, okay, well, I was talking to a couple of elders 40 years ago. Do these place names still matter? Do these place stories still matter in the face of, expansive culture change, industrialization, and things like that? And the answer is, yeah, very much so. And you can see that in a conflict called Oak Flat that involved a specific Apache group in Arizona. So if I can get YouTube to work, and I can't. That's fun. Okay, hold on. Here we go. So I will fully admit right at the start that this is a video that has a political agenda and leaning about this specific mine that they're going to be talking about. So just full disclosure on that. I'm not promoting that specific viewpoint. Instead, I'm trying to show this as an example of the ways in which people's place meanings directly and deeply inform their view of the world right up here in the 21st century, and the way that can motivate people's actions. So Oak Flat is this area that was, it's kind of hard to explain it, but basically there's a piece of land that is National Park Service land in Arizona, and it was traded with a mining company for more that had private land holdings. They basically did a land swap, kind of like a 2-to-1 land swap, where the Park Service got more land than they'd previously had by taking some of the mining company's land, but then the mining company got this very economically valuable copper mining land called Oak Flat. But Oak Flat also has tremendous meaning to Apache people, as we'll learn about. This is from 2015.
This is such a great opportunity for us to stand up for our land. You know, the land that's been taken from us, and it has, the way I look at all of our land, every piece of property, it belongs to the great creator. And with the mining company that's coming in, they want to come and destroy our land.
Oak Flat is who I am. As I lived in Mesa, Arizona, in the city my whole life. And every time we went to the reservation, you have to go through Oak Flat. We would stop there and pray. My mom and my grandmother taught me how to pray. You know, this is a place for me as a young girl, being raised at these places, being who I am, to be free from the city, because, you know, being oppressed in the city, discriminated of who you are, you get that a lot, and you get ashamed of who you are. But going to these places is what made me strong. Going to Oak Flat reminded me of how powerful my people are and how close we are with the connection to Mother Earth.
Back in December.
So it's easy, I think, sometimes with Native American environmental struggles, especially when a sacred site is involved, to kind of easily not write that off, but easily simplify the narrative into one of just sort of like sacred space and therefore religious matters, which you might be strongly in support of protecting it, but still it's easy to kind of simplify it in just those terms. But I want you to notice as folks are talking in this video, the many valences, the many meanings that people are bringing to the table about this land that are not just about ceremony, although ceremony does occur at this site. Prayer does occur at this site, but also things like she was just saying a moment ago, right? Meaning of who we are as a person, feeling like you're home, feeling like you're away from a city where you're persecuted.
At 11 p.m. one night, United States Congress decided to make public a bill called the Southeastern Arizona Land Exchange Act. That bill is going to transfer the ownership of an area that's sacred to Apaches and other tribes to a mining company, Resolution Copper.
Leave the Apaches alone. Let us remain to practice our culture, say our prayers, pick our acorn at Oak Flat. That's all we ask America.
So acorn gathering as well, traditional place of harvest.
President Obama, if you hear this message, you have the authority to use the Antiquities Act and prohibit mining on Oak Flat. Thank you.
We are human beings, you know. Our fight is your fight, you know. And to them, what they don't realize is that everybody that they stand for, as far as their constituents, their people in their districts, it affects them now also. Because now it opened the door to all federal land. This one bill opened the door to all federal land for development and corporations to come in.
Please know your history. Because when McCain put this in the defense bill, it brought back social illness to the reservation. Because we were marched there by military force.
So then also, again, layers of meaning other than just a site for ceremony, a site associated with displacement from the site, right? And a marker of the reservation and of displacement from other ancestral homelands. And also this specific site, there's a history here where a number of Apache people were cornered by an invading army and chose to jump off the cliff at Oak Flat rather than surrender to US Army forces. And so that's another kind of layer of what this place means to people as a kind of an act of defiance and opposition to colonialism.
And confined in the reservation, denied the opportunity to go back to what God has given us. And so when we occupied Oak Flats, really that's going home, where we originated from. But going back, and now all of a sudden we have military flyovers, drones that come in and take pictures of us. So it makes us wonder. It tries to scare us, but we will not fear no more.
Today, all of our voices are going to be heard. Today, we're not going to let this try to destroy us. We're not going to let this materialistic, man-made city try to destroy who we are, because they're getting blind by that greed, by that money, and we're standing up to that. We're saying that we all have a right to believe in what we need to believe in. We all have a right to stand up for these sacred sites, because if this gets taken away, if Oak Flat gets destroyed, and it can't come back. It can't come back. As an Apache girl, that's who I am. That's where I come from. That's the land, because we are all children of our Mother Earth right here. And so we're going to stand up. This is what Apache Stronghold and what we are doing today. Standing up, taking that step to a better future, so that my future children have a right to be who they are and have no fear to come to these holy lands and have no fear to be who they are. That's what I'm fighting for.
So as you can see then, about a lot more than, not only is it about more than being a ceremonial site, although it's definitely that, it's a site of historic resistance to colonialism. It's a site associated with confinement to the reservation and displacement. It's a site associated with cultural identity and a space away from persecution. It's a site associated with who we're going to be in the future. So there's just kind of layers and layers of that meaning. And so again, but it's motivating people enough to, in this case, right, travel hundreds of miles from their home to Washington, D.C., speak out against a mine, right? So place matters, right? Place matters very deeply. Another example of that I put into the readings folder that I thought was pretty profound of people's placemaking, of people's symbolic landscapes, of what landscapes mean to them, was the We All Live on Permafrost reading by Susan Crate, who's done just fantastic work in Siberia. She talks about, specifically with the Saka group, which is an indigenous Siberian group, who traditionally are horse breeders and use these large kind of flat grassy, partly up to the forest kind of areas called alaz, ALAAS, not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. But they have noticed over time that the alaz areas, where they were eventually displaced, but when USSR took over and forced people onto collectivist farms. But formerly, these were places people used, and nowadays, from what I gather, people are starting to use them again. And also people have been, even when they were displaced from them, still kind of going back to connect emotionally and spiritually. And there's this perception that like horses need these like nice open areas where it's really snowy and icy and their feet can move through and crunch through and get to this special kind of grass that's under there that actually lasts through the winter. And that it's actually good for the horses and good for the land, better than going off into a forest and nearly starving to death through the winter. But they say, you know, now the land surface is now rolling and wavy because of the melting of the permafrost under conditions of warming temperatures. As we Saka have started to call it Abahi Ungul Libet, where evil spirits danced. So it's like the land looks like something evil is dancing across it. It used to be flat, now it's rolling. So it's kind of fascinating, right? And people also talk about Jil or Guha, the idea of the bull of winter who controls the weather during these 3 winter months, but that the bull of winter no longer comes, right? The heaviest part of winter no longer comes because people are noticing these changes, right? They are noticing, and it's reflected in their naming practices and in how they refer to the land. You know, and I think this shows that land means a lot to people and that they want to name it something meaningful to them, and also that it's connected with who they are as horse herding people, and what a profound effect it is to see it changing quite literally right under their feet. I'm now going to shift gears a little bit and talk about a set of kind of ethical concepts that relate to also this concept of placemaking, but kind of take it in a different direction into kind of more of an environmental ethics direction. And so I want to talk about a tale of 2 agencies. So within, actually, you know what, this goes better somewhere else. So I'm going to pause it for a second and then we'll do a new video. No, you know, this, okay, yeah, I'm going to move a couple slides really quick. Okay, sorry, just kind of had to rearrange things slightly. So I want to jump topics now and talk about environmental ethics, but we're kind of going to approach it at first through a land-based topic that ties in well with what we were just talking about symbolic landscapes and what lands mean to each other. So I want to tell you a tale of 2 agencies, and I want to tell you right at the start that this is a simplified tale and that it's considerably more complex than this, the actual history of it. But nonetheless, I'm going to try to tell the story as we often tell this story, and it's still, there's a lot of, it's overall accurate, even if there's more nuance that we're not going to have time to get into. So this guy over here is Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was foundational as a president in establishing what we now think of as the public land system. It was under his tenure, the National Park Service and U.S. Forest Service both kind of took their form as they kind of currently are. They had predecessors, but he very much expanded the national park system and made the USFS into more what it is now. Interestingly, you probably know that Roosevelt was a great lover of the outdoors, big hunter. What you may or may not know is that he was friends, or at least friendly associates with 2 extremely influential people in the early 20th century US who had huge effects on how the US does land conservation, and by extension, a huge effect on how many parts of the world do land conservation, since some of the ideas that developed out of the US went on to influence how public lands are treated in other countries as well. So first guy that he was buddies with was this guy, John Weir. So John Weir, if you don't know anything about him, hippy dippy dude, liked to before hippy dippy was a thing, I like to say. So John Muir very much was a child of the transcendental movement, although that was a few decades before him, very much into this idea that cities cause problems for human beings and that we needed to retreat on occasion to places that were not cities, that were nature, that nature was like a cathedral that you needed to retreat to as kind of a place of refuge for your soul. He taught, and he enjoyed things like, hanging out on the very top of a tree during a lightning storm, just to kind of give you where his mind space was at. He liked this kind of direct connection to nature, drinking sap right off of a tree, just like get out there and experience it in these like really vivid experiential ways. And he very much, and he, stood up for things like the protection of the Yosemite Valley. He stood up against what's called the Hetch Hetchy Dam, which is this whole battle that went on. And he was not the founder of the Park Service, but pretty influential in kind of galvanizing the park system into what it eventually became and what it is today. And he was strongly associated with a type of philosophy. I'm not sure he ever used this term, but we use it now in speaking about him and of others at the time period, of preservationism towards nature. Preservationism being the idea, or rather the ethical stance, that nature, or at least certain parts of nature, should be entirely left alone, perhaps enjoyed by hiking or camping, but that they should not be developed for a resource. Preservationism. Leave it alone, allow it to be enjoyed for future human beings, that nature was an implicit good in itself, or perhaps that it was an implicit good to the extent that it was a refuge for human beings. And you can see a pretty direct genealogical line of descent from that concept into the National Park Service. The Park Service lands, I won't say that they're entirely restrictive. There are situations where people can do certain kinds of more extractive activities on Park Service lands, but in general, the Park Service lands are sort of there. The national parks, places like Yosemite and Yellowstone and Glacier and St. Wrangell, are there as places where you go and you recreate, you go and you canoe, you go and you camp, but not places to go and mine, not places to go and extract timber. That's not the point. They're meant to be a place of refuge, a place of getting out into nature, quote unquote. Conservationism was associated with this other buddy of Teddy Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot. And can I just say, I love this picture of Gifford Pinchot. I feel like this picture of Gifford Pinchot, like that dude just told a really funny joke or something. Like, I don't know what he's laughing about, but he is just having a good time. But Gifford Pinchot, he was raised in sort of the German forestry school of thought out of Europe, which was very much based on this idea of scientific forestry, as it was being called at the time, and this idea of we should use forests, use them for their resources, but that there's a scientific and smart way to do that, where we take a certain amount and then maximize the amount of yield we get over time by not overusing it. That if we're scientific about it, that if we're precise about how much we cut, that'll lead to the most possible benefit for us over time. So that itself, so conservationism, the idea of protecting nature for its use for human beings, that we will conserve resources so that they can effectively continue to be used. So not just for their own sake, but so that we can use them, but use them in a sustainable way. So nowadays, when people talk about sustainability, oftentimes they're kind of getting at something like this, right? Sustainable kind of extraction. And this was heavily influenced, one that's been argued among others by my good friend and colleague, Seth Baker, that it's been argued that this is very much the inheritor of Jeremy Bentham, is a philosopher from Europe, Benthamite sort of utilitarianism, the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number of people, that like forests are good, a public good that needs to be maintained so we can continue to get lumber from them, as well as things like having a certain amount of trees in place to provide for water filtration. So we don't have to spend all our money on filtering water, let the forest do it for us. That line of thinking of conservationism, if you know much about the US Forest Service, you can see a pretty direct train of thought from Pinchot's kind of thinking to Forest Service and the Forest Service lands, which manages a different set of public lands than the Park Service. And in Forest Service lands, traditionally, it's not a free-for-all by any stretch of the imagination. They have a definite clear set of regulations that they operate under, but they do allow on some Forest Service lands logging and things like that. That's part of the purpose of them. Originally, they were thought of as sort of a forest reserve. In fact, they grew out of the forest America's Forest Reserve. And the idea of let's manage these forests in such a way that we don't just lose all our forest lands, because that's the way it looked like it was going in the early 20th century. Let's make sure that some of the forest lands in the US are logged sustainably so we can continue to have timber resources in the future for future generations. Conserve it for the future so the future can still use it. So you can see two really different paradigms, and they led to two really different kinds of agencies. Nowadays, those differences might not be quite so apparent because, for example, the Forest Service now operates under certain other kinds of laws that have been layered on over time, like the Endangered Species Act or the Roadless Area Rule, that add layers of more straight preservationism to it, like more of a pure let's defend nature for nature's sake kind of ideology. But generally speaking, these lands have very different types of protections. You see logging and sometimes mining and things in areas like this that you're just not going to see on lands like this, and they come from two very different types of philosophies. So lest you think that one person can't make a difference, they certainly can if they've got the ear of the president of the United States. And if the president of the United States is Teddy frickin' Roosevelt, then yes, one person can definitely make a difference. By the way, and you could go further on the environmental ethics sort of from the, if this is one end of the spectrum of sort of leave it all alone, and this is sort of a middle ground approach of protect it for use it responsibly, you could go even further and talk about just straight extractivism, right? The idea of just nature should be used as much as possible for human needs. But I don't know anybody who like is a pure, I know very few people that are a pure extractivist who think there should be like zero environmental regulation, zero conservation or anything. So I didn't have a good example for that. So I just said the bad guys on Captain Planet. I don't know if you ever watched that cartoon as a kid, right? It almost seemed like the polluters like had no other goal in mind other than just polluting, like it was fun for them or something. But anyways, Park Service, Forest Service kind of come out of these very specific trains of thought. Now, one could point out that Park Service, some have said, well, is that itself sort of a commodification of the land, because you have to make modifications to make them into these kind of tourism hotspots, especially for some of the more popular parks like Glacier or like Yellowstone. But for a minute, we're not going to touch that idea particularly. One of the points that I want to make is that although we can distinguish these different types of environmental ethic frameworks of how we approach land, of preservationism, conservationism, extractivism, most of us are somewhere on a spectrum of this, not solely one of them. Or perhaps to put it even better, most of us operate on various points of the spectrum depending on what we're talking about. I think there are very few people that want to log the redwoods or oil drill in Yellowstone. I'm not even sure if there is oil in Yellowstone, but you get what I'm trying to say there. I think there are certain types of land that are popular just across the political spectrum of people think like that's a land that it's just there for people to get out and see. It's just sort of a natural treasure that's just there. And then I think there are very few people so most of us operate as preservationists at least part of the time, but some people far more than others, right? Some people think that vast parts of the United States or of the world in general should be preserved in that sense, right? There's the 40% for nature movement, if you've ever heard of that, as one good example. The idea that we need to fully set aside 40% of the land purely for non-human use if we're going to successfully conserve all of the imperiled species. And that's been advocated by people like Edward Wilson, for example, the famous biologist E.O. Wilson. And, I think a lot of us are this, depending on the thing as well, right? I drive in a car using oil and I live in a wooden house. So it stands to reason that whether or not I'm fully willing to admit it, I am willing to admit it, but some people aren't, that I believe that some types of landscapes should be utilized for resources that so long as we do it responsibly and in a way that doesn't compromise the ecosystem. And for that matter, I think that it's okay for certain lands to just have a bunch of human buildings on them, right? I'm not anti-city. So from that perspective, clearly some of us are this, and clearly some of us, as perhaps the city example shares, at least part of the time we're operating on this framework, right? We do consider certain lands to be not free-for-alls necessarily. Obviously, you don't want things to be done irresponsibly, but as lands where there's going to be a huge human impact, and we kind of accept and acknowledge that as part of the equation. So most of us, generally, this is a spectrum. Generally, people aren't just one thing, and it may depend very much on the lands that we're talking about. But you can, like I said, definitely see their iterations still today. By the way, there's another type of natural of land agency that you really should be familiar with, but it doesn't have as fun of a story behind it, is the Bureau of Land Management. People sometimes jokingly call it the Bureau of Livestock and Mining, although I think that's very, very harsh because BLM actually does a lot of conservation work as well. But it is true that Bureau of Land Management grew out of the General Land Office, which was basically kind of a catch-all of like public lands, many of which the federal government had taken from Native Americans, which were then just kind of put into like the General Land Office. And that eventually, and then there was also this thing called the Grazing Service to make sure that lands were permitted out to ranchers and that this was done in some kind of an orderly fashion, and that eventually grew into the Bureau of Land Management. It's associated strongly with the concept of multiple use. Bureau of Land Management lands are kind of by their nature, some of them are recreation lands, they're there for things like ATVs, or boating, some of them are mining lands, some of them are ranchers use them to run cattle on, all sorts, and some of them are conservation areas, so kind of all sorts of different things. And talking about kind of the different ethical orientations behind these different public land agencies is not just sort of me being a nerd, although certainly I'm a nerd. It's very relevant if you live here in Alaska, or really anywhere in the US West. As you can see, we live in the state with the highest percentage, other than Nevada, of federal land as a percentage of total land. Very, very high percentage, at about 70%. Now, when you say that, though, you also want to be really careful and cautious about what you mean by that, because as I mentioned before, that can give the suggestion that 70% of Alaska is entirely frozen from resource development, and that is not at all the case. A lot of what we think of as the oil development activities and logging and commercial fishing goes on public lands. And so it's, as well as state lands. And so as you can see, for example, we have huge wildlife refuges where, among other things, you can typically hunt, at least for parts of it. So that's these TAN, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Lands. We didn't even talk about them as another agency, though they're one that's a lot more powerful here in Alaska than they are in most states. The National Park Service lands in green, U.S. Forest Service in dark green, as you can see, very much a power player down in Southeast Alaska, as well as places like Chugach National Forest. And then you've got a huge amount of BLM lands where a lot of oil drilling happens, among other things. So it's not all one thing, right? You have areas that are comparatively very restrictive in how humans can use the resources other than recreation. And you have areas that are a lot less restrictive than that. All right, so one of the things I want us to think about, though, as we think about those public land agencies is specifically Muir's ideas and this idea of wilderness. And so eventually ideas like that filtered pretty heavily into various strains of environmental thought in the US. And you eventually had things like the Wilderness Act in 1969, which designates certain public lands, a small chunk of public lands, as quote wilderness areas. And the way that they define that is by saying, for example, quote, a place where man is a visitor and does not remain, or a place untrammeled by man. So there's very much this concept in American environmental thinking of wilderness, of certain landscapes more than others even, that have just not had a strong human presence at all and are therefore in their natural undisturbed state. And sometimes we kind of have a sense that that's what we're managing towards, right? That we're trying to help certain kinds of lands, that saving them means like make them look like what they looked like before humans messed up with them, or help them keep the way they look, and not have sort of humans messing up the place. And I don't want to seem like I don't support wilderness areas, because that isn't true. I think that's an important part of our conservation toolkit. And I think that they can have value for sure, definitely. I do want to suggest, though, that as anthropologists, we have oftentimes sort of pumped the brakes a bit on this, as have environmental historians and others who've brought up the fact that the way we speak about wilderness, so I'm not talking here about the political position of a wilderness policy. I think the fact that we have these extra protected wilderness areas can be a really good thing and a really, really helpful thing in conservation. But the discourse behind it, the idea of an untouched nature where man is a visitor and does not remain, does not make a lot of anthropological sense as far as we can tell, or at least there's a lot of scholars who feel like it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so I had you read a piece by Claudia Gabe talking about this, how wilderness was invented without indigenous peoples. And as she was touching on, really since for a long time, including since the 90s, with a famous paper called The Pristine Myth by William Denevan, who was an environmental historian, a lot of scholars have brought up the idea that this idea of an untouched wilderness, that prior to 1492 was sort of this untouched non-human space of, sort of ecological harmony, can be surprisingly not helpful discourse and not an accurate discourse. And we increasingly have more and more and more research studies that suggest that large portions of the world have been altered by human beings for centuries. And so, for example, down in the Amazon, you have areas where there's a higher percentage of, for example, cocoa bearing trees and different kinds of trees, coffee bearing trees, trees that are clearly like human trees, like trees that humans like, even though they're wild trees, that you find them more around Mayan ruins than around other areas. So it's clear that the rainforest has been, with this Amazon rainforest that we think of as like this untouched region and biodiversity hotspot, has actually had human influences on it, not over all of it, but over decent chunks of it, right? And that areas that we once thought had a relatively small population of hunter-gatherers, in fact, had much larger populations. LIDAR studies coming out just in the last few years showing that the population of sort of the Mayan Empire Mesoamerican region was probably a couple orders of magnitude higher than what we actually thought it was, millions. And millions, and same with the Amazon rainforest. And so there's a lot of land that we are used to thinking of as relatively untouched, as kind of these untouched refuges, these Edens, if you will, that in reality have had human influence. Again, not everywhere, but decent chunks of these landscapes. And similarly, large parts of the Great Plains of the United States were affected by things like controlled burns that were done in certain areas. Again, this would have been patchy. This wouldn't have been over the entire landscape, but there were controlled burns happening where you would have Native American plains groups that were setting fire to parts of the land because if you don't know much about ecological succession, you probably already know this, but over time, grasslands, in many areas, grasslands will become forests if you give them enough time and if they're not disturbed by anything. There's a natural process, right? Grasses invade an area early on. Trees take a longer time to grow and colonize a space, but once they do, they can shade out other things and just be a stronger or hardier competitor. So there's this dynamic interplay between grasslands and forests. And one of the reasons that there's so much grasslands in the middle of the country, which is one of the reasons we have a breadbasket there, is because of fires that were being set. It was already really grassy terrain, but Native American groups were intentionally keeping it that way or encouraging it to keep being grassy with these burns that would help be good for the types of animals that they were hunting, bison among many others. So the Americas were not untouched, obviously. And we can think of plenty of other examples as well. Aboriginal Australia was definitely not untouched, and the beautiful landscapes down there were very much affected by, as we talked about, people's intentional fire practices. We could talk about in Nevada and people's intentional plant cultivation practices as hunter-gatherers, and why certain plants are more abundant than others in certain areas. In subtle and sometimes profound ways, people were affecting their lands, both agricultural people and non-agricultural people. So the idea of an untouched wilderness prior to be blunt, Euro-Americans or white Americans showing up is not entirely historically accurate by any stretch, nor would that be accurate of Australia, Aboriginal Australia, nor would that be accurate of sub-Saharan Africa, nor many other spaces that have experienced the tremendously disastrous effects often of colonialism. And yes, that has oftentimes accelerated and brought about industrialism, which has very much accelerated the rate of environmental change and caused a lot of environmental problems. I'm not trying to do a false equivalency here, and neither are these other scholars, but they are trying to suggest that even if the impacts were less, there have been impacts historically. There weren't just vast swaths of like non-human space or something, partly because that can lead to problematic kinds of thinking. Early English settlers viewed the United States as terra nullius, as empty land that Native Americans were hardly using, partly a reflection of the fact that many Native Americans had died by that point of infectious diseases in that specific part of the continent. So the population was significantly lower than it normally would have been, but also just this kind of thinking that if there's not a farm there, it's not being taken, which is of course very convenient if you want to take the land. So that was a damaging discourse, this idea of a pristine wilderness. But also on the flip side of that, there's people who want to turn it into things like wilderness areas and national parks, including John Muir, and that kind of idea of a non-human space could also be damaging there. So you definitely had, not for every national park by any stretch of the imagination, but you did have parks here and there where their establishment coincided with Native people losing their land. Either the park was set up right after Native people lost their land, or in the case of Glacier National Park, one of my favorites, You had Blackfeet Nation sell a bunch of lands to the Park Service or back to the government, but as a result of like a terrible winter that they'd had, and they were in a really economically bad place, which obviously that's like, there's a colonial history to why they were in an economically bad place. So although it wasn't directly just sort of Glacier National Park directly displacing that land, essentially they were benefiting from colonialism in that regard. And so when we think of these land, and there definitely were examples of people being displaced or driven into smaller areas because of the establishment of a national park. Grand Canyon National Park led to the Havasupai people for several decades, essentially being confined to a small reservation at the bottom of the valley, or at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, when historically they also used the tablelands at the top of the Grand Canyon to run cattle and to hunt. So, or to run sheep and to hunt. So my point with all of this is that if we think of these lands as non-human spaces, that can lead to outcomes that I don't think any of us really want, as far as people losing their homelands. It's a good example of how discourse can lead to all sorts of things that we don't always expect it to, both things that favor resource extraction and then also things that favor the opposite extreme of sort of resource locking up to the point of driving out indigenous people. All right, well, we've covered a lot of ground then with landscape and with placemaking. And so I want us to think, what places are meaningful to you? How did they become so? And what would it mean for those places to change? And perhaps also with kind of the last topic we just talked about, what does it mean for you for that space to be respected and protected? If you want it to be protected, what does protected mean? And who's included and how? And I don't think there's any easy answers. I don't think there's a single right answer. I may seem like I've been critical of conservation in this lecture, and I don't mean it to be so. Our land agencies do incredibly important work. I'm literally about to go hike in a wildlife refuge, the Kenai Wildlife Refuge, with my kid that I really, really like and enjoy. And the rangers there do absolutely phenomenal work. And they often have interns from our local Knights Indian tribe, which I think is fantastic. Their exhibit gives people great education about traditional Knights-y uses of the land that people aren't normally exposed to typically in this area. They just do a lot of phenomenally good work, and they do a lot of good work too on a practical level, making sure that certain populations aren't overhunted and that we continue to have good populations of really beautiful wildlife. So I'm not trying to diss on land agencies, but I'm trying to suggest that there's a whole lot of different ideas about what land is and what it's for and what it means to protect it, and that this manifests in different ways, complicated ways in our policy world, and that it's not always nearly so simple as the narratives that we tell each other. So we need to think seriously about placemaking and the many different meanings people might attach to one single place. Every mountain is more than just one mountain.